I'd like to just welcome you all to our latest event in the AMOR MUNDI Multispecies Ecological World-Making Lab speaker series called Humans and Other Animals in the Capitalocene. And we're super excited for today's talk, Marx for Cats, a Radical Bestiary, a talk by critical theorist Leigh Berge, with a roundtable discussion with biological anthropologist Barbara J, film scholar Yiman Wang, literary scholar Amit Baishya, and independent artist and researcher Terike Haapoja. And I'm moderating, and hopefully some of you know me. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about who I am. I need to first start out by thanking our CMU, Chiang Mai University affiliated hosts, the Regional Center for Social Science and Sustainable Development, and the Integrative Center for Humanities Innovation. And then I'd like to lay out some housekeeping rules. So before we get started, please observe these. Mics off unless you are the speaker. That means everyone except for Leigh until the Q&A session and the roundtable. And video off, please, just so that it's not distracting. And you're welcome at any time during the talk to put questions into the chat. They won't be addressed immediately, but we will have time to address them at the end. We will be ending promptly at the 2-hour mark. So everybody just keep that in mind as well. Because I know some of you who are old regular participants know we sometimes go on, but not today. All right, so let me just introduce the AMOR MUNDI Lab very briefly. For those of you who don't know, we are a multidisciplinary intersectional research initiative based in the Global South, investigating how human and more than human world making processes and survival are entangled mutually. And our aim is to grow a knowledge-making community by fostering dialogues and collaborations across disciplines and practices. I will give a brief land acknowledgement, although I don't do the typical one. Mine is a more than human multi-species kind of land acknowledgement. Our lab acknowledges that the land on which we all speak, work, and live belongs to all earthly beings, past, present, and future, that including the many diverse indigenous peoples who came here and made homes long before there were nations or states. Acknowledgements, however, are not enough. We need to begin actively decolonizing our relations with the natural world, of which humans are but a small part, in spite of the big, giant, heavy shadow that we have cast upon that world. So I've already introduced the title of the talk. Again, Marx for Cats, a Radical Bestiary. Now let me introduce our speaker. The fabulous critical theorist Leigh Berge is a professor of English at BMCC CUNY. She's the author of numerous works of economically oriented criticism, including the book Scandals and Abstraction, Financial Fiction of the Long 1980s, Wages Against Artwork, Decommodified Labor, and Claims of Socially Engaged Art. Marx for Cats, a Radical Bestiary, and of course, also the co-editor of Reading Capitalism, Realism, and currently finishing a memoir entitled Fake Work, How I Began to Suspect That Capitalism is a Joke, which will come out in 2025 from Haymarket Books. I'm going to post, everybody's bios into the chat since I won't be reading everyone else's bios out completely. So let me know. I posted them once before, but it turned out no one can see them who hasn't already joined. So if I post this now, can everybody see this? That way you have reference to the speakers more. All right, so I'm going to turn the table over now to Leigh, who has about 30 minutes, give or take, to introduce us to some of the brilliant provocations in this thoughtful, moving, expansive book. And then we'll turn it over to the roundtable discussion and finally to Q&A with the audience. In the meantime, again, for those of you who have just joined, please turn your mic and your video off. And you may put your comments in the chat for later. All right? All right. Thanks, everybody. And I turn the floor over to Leigh. And everybody else, let's turn off our videos and our mics.
Thank you. And thank you so much for having me. Before I start speaking, I do just want to share my screen. I'll have a PowerPoint presentation here. Okay. So thank you all for coming, and thank you for the respondents, and also to Maya for organizing this. What I'm going to do is just read a little bit from the introduction of the book and give an overview, and then I'll read a little bit from one of the chapters of the book. So the gambit of Marx for Cats is that the history of Western capitalism can be told through the cat, and that doing so reveals a heretofore unrecognized animality at the heart of Marx's critique and of Marxist critique. That animality has most often been feline, and it has been present in how Marxists have represented what constitutes the economy and imagined how the economy could be transformed from a site of exploitation into one of equality. From capitalism's feudal prehistory to its contemporary moment of globalization, those seeking to maintain economic power, as well as those seeking to challenge it, have recruited cats into their efforts. Medieval kings and lords styled themselves as lions. Dissidents from the medieval order were identified through their relationships with domestic cats. The first real capitalist empire, Great Britain, adopted a leonine symbol, while some of the most powerful worker actions against capitalism have been known as wildcat strikes. In the 1960s and 70s in the United States, the Black Panther Party insisted that capitalism was a fundamentally racist system and demanded its overturning. History's most robust critic of capitalism, Karl Marx himself, likewise has a feline genealogy. He's a descendant of the famous Katzenellenbogen line of Ashkenazi Jews, who first hailed from the Rhineland, but who fled to Venice in the early 16th century. Katzenellenbogen translates from German as cat's elbow, and today in the Jewish cemetery in Padua, Italy, right outside of Venice, Marx's family tombstones are each marked with this image of a diminutive cat. Like any text in the Marxist tradition, Marx for Cats gestures in two directions at once. In asking how our society is structured and for whom, Marxism turns towards economic history. And with the materials it finds there, it begins to conceive of how the present might have been different and how the future still could be. In offering a feline narrative of our economic past, I argue that Marxism not only has the potential to be an interspecies project, but that it already is one. And in using that knowledge and those histories presented in the book in cat form, I suggest we may collectively plot a new future together, one which recognizes the work that cats have always done for Marxists, and one which wonders what political commitments can Marxists make to cats. In bringing together Marxism and cats, I follow Perry Anderson, who writes, quote, "To take liberties with the signature of Marx is merely to enter the freedom of Marxism," end quote. And what kind of freedom do we enter? Well, it's the freedom to locate a new history. Beginning in the 8th century Common Era and moving forward into our own day, Marx for Cats should be understood as what the philosopher Walter Benjamin called a Tigersprung, or a tiger's leap into the past. Marx often spoke of leaps in describing the movement of capital, and cats leap too, of course. But for now, we'll keep our focus on Walter Benjamin, for whom the recollection of a historical moment always functions as a kind of return to it. And Benjamin suggests that a big cat, a tiger, is the animal to guide us there. In the most revolutionary eruptions of both feudalism and capitalism, the peasant uprisings of the Middle Ages, the Paris Commune of the modern age, the queer and communist movements of the 20th century. In each of these radical reformulations of economic power and possibility, cats were present. Take the medieval witch, a woman of excessive sexuality and uncommon knowledge, who was often identified through her relations with her cat. Or Louise Michel, anarchist and Paris communard, who traced her own revolutionary fortitude to her comradeship with animals, and who wrote a series of letters to her cat from her exile in the South Pacific. Or of Rosa Luxemburg, one of my book's more tragic figures, who realized and theorized that capitalism couldn't be a closed system, that forms of credit and debt-based imperialism would be required to enable accumulation, but who couldn't understand that her love for her cat Mimi, or her companionship with the animals who worked in the prison yard where she was incarcerated during World War I, might augur an interspecies Marxism. I trust that you can see I've used Anderson's injunction to broaden my archive. Yet the freedom of which Anderson speaks is also the freedom to locate a new Marx, who it turns out made use of cats to formulate his theory of revolution, value, and abstraction. In 1848, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels penned the Communist Manifesto, in which they predicted the abolition of the state and private property as a wave of revolution swept through Europe. They proclaimed that all history is the history of class struggle. A year after those famous words were announced, they were exiled to London, where they congregated with other radicals at London's Red Lion pub, a location whose name recalls the most imperial animal of all. And when, 3 years later, Marx contended in the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte with the fact that his predictions had failed to materialize, that the revolutions had dissolved, he now claimed Europe was operating under the spell of a Katzenjammer, or a cat's wail, which had prevented the overturning of capitalism, but from which he believed the continent would ultimately emerge. Marx wrote, "Bourgeois revolutions are short-lived. They have reached their zenith, and a long Katzenjammer takes hold of society before it learns to assimilate the results of its storm and stress period soberly." Indeed, what we start to realize is that all history is the history of cat struggle, too. Marx himself was a great lover of literature and consumed multiple styles, languages, and genres. His writings have an artful and literary playfulness that often goes unremarked. Citing the great philosopher G.W.F. Hegel, for example, Marx explains that, quote, "Hegel remarked somewhere that all great world historical facts and personages appear, so to speak, twice. He forgot to add, the first time as tragedy, the second time as farce." Marx for cats should be understood as both. Using the feline in multiple form, this book attends to capitalism's tragedies, as well as to the farcical moments that punctuate its history. It tells the cat story of capitalism, limits the special role that economic history has reserved for cats. From 10th and 11th century feudal glory to our own days of zoos and deforestation, from the cat shows to the wildcat strikes, from the lion hunts to the cat cafes. And I'll just present very quickly a table of contents for the book. So you can see the book really spans about a 1200-year history as it looks at sort of key moments in perceived Marxist historiographic argumentation. So feudalism, revolution, the rise of the bourgeoisie, and then the 20th century rise of the communist state. And this is what the book looks like in final form. As the book moves through this economic history, century by century, the feline guides us through such tragedies, sometimes witnessing them, sometimes becoming part of them. And part of the tragedy, for Marxists anyway, has been their failure to appreciate the gravity of this fact. In place of alliance, they have sought domination, whether in Che Guevara's instruction to, quote, "study hard to master technique, which gives you mastery over nature," end quote, or Friedrich Engels' claim that, quote, "the final victory of the socialist proletariat will be a leap of humanity from the animal world into the world of freedom," end quote. Such sentiments were bad enough in previous centuries, but in our own present of climate catastrophe and zoonotic illness, they're simply unacceptable. Now, a quick note on methodology. This project began as a series of cat videos in which I would explain certain key concepts of Marx's oeuvre, so alienation, money, labor, finance, interest-bearing capital, commodity, to a group of cats. And that project is still up online. It's at marxforcats.com. And it was in looking for the through lines to make these videos that I thought the cats might appreciate that I discovered the archive that subsequently became this book. And it was with cats on my mind that I conceived of this book as a bestiary. So in the Middle Ages, these bestiaries are illustrated books. They were quite lavishly illustrated. Featured the depiction of beasts who would reveal crucial truths about the hierarchies which structured the God-made world. Medieval bestiaries followed the guidance offered in the Bible's book of Job, whose counsel was to, quote, "ask the animals, they will teach you," end quote. My preference for the bestiary is that it connects past and present, that it allows for a visual logic alongside a verbal one, and most importantly, that it takes animals seriously. But the bestiary aspires to a prelapsarian timelessness, and that requires amendment to place them in a properly Marxist frame. So Marx for Cats is a bestiary that takes a longue durée approach to economic history. It was Giovanni Arrighi and his work on the centuries of finance capital, the long 20th century, that introduced me to the longue durée of history as method. In the mid-1990s, while trying to understand the import and novelty of late 20th century global financial expansion, Arrighi tarried with the usual questions Marxists ask about periodization. Had capitalism transformed? Had it entered into a new phase of development? No, he concluded, quite correctly. And he wrote, and this is a long quote, so I will put up the slide. Finance capital is not a particular stage of world capitalism, let alone its latest and highest stage. Rather, is it a recurrent phenomenon which has marked the capitalist era from its earliest beginnings in late medieval and early modern Europe. Throughout the capitalist era, financial expansions have signaled the transition from one regime of accumulation on a world scale to another. They are integral aspects of the recurrent destruction of old regimes and the simultaneous creation of new ones. Now, what I found is that you can replace finance capital with cat and accomplish similar theoretical work. So let's try that. Cats are not a particular stage of capitalism, let alone its highest stage. Rather, cats are a recurrent phenomenon which have marked the capitalist era from its early beginnings in late medieval and early modern Europe. Throughout the capitalist era, cats have signaled the transition from one regime of accumulation on a world scale to another. They are integral aspects of the recurrent destruction of old regimes and the simultaneous creation of new ones. So now what I would like to do is read a little bit from chapter 4, which is about the French and Haitian revolutions, and sort of give you a taste of the meat of the chapters of the book, although meat was probably a bad word to use. So the content of the chapters of the book. So this is a slide from the French Revolution, which shows on the left-hand side a Jacobin taming the regal lion, while on the right side you can see that the priest and the nobility fight each other. Okay, so I'll begin this with a quote. Like the fall of Rome or the rise of capitalism, the origins of the French Revolution have been debated again and again, writes Marxist historian Georges Lefebvre in his famous study, The Coming of the French Revolution. It was he who pioneered the term that inspired generations of Marxist social historians, history from below. To write a history of society, one must look towards its lowliest members. In Lefebvre's case, he looked to French peasants. In our case, we will look to French cats, who are often held in higher station than peasants, but who nonetheless will be our entry point into this subterranean history. A bête noire of conservatives in its own day and still in ours, the French Revolution was, according to Marx, quote, the most colossal revolution that history has ever known, end quote. At the height of their historical radicality, French revolutionaries abolished slavery, denuded France of the influence of the Catholic Church, executed their king and queen, and liberated big cats from the royal menagerie. But that height was a short-lived one, and no sooner did the regal blood dry on the guillotine than the executioners became the executed, slavery was reestablished, and a new emperor, the lion-loving, cat-hating Napoleon Bonaparte, emerged to take the lead in history. Nonetheless, Marx claims, the revolution constituted, quote, the victory of a new social order. Part of the social order of which Marx speaks was the dawning of a secular philosophy and literature, of transformed ideas of humanistic citizenship and friendship, as well as a novel kind of science called natural history. Take the recording and organization of time, for example. Gone were the 12 months of the Gregorian calendar and the old days of the year, each of which had been named for a particular saint in the Catholic Church. Revolutionaries introduced the French Republican calendar, in which each day of the year was dedicated to a plant, animal, or earthly element. They had new months too, but if you look under Nouveau's 25, you will see the French word chat or cat. In this period's philosophy, freedom became assumed as both a condition for and an end of human flourishing. Quote, "Man is born free and everywhere he is in chains," end quote, declares the most famous first sentence of the vegetarian Jean-Jacques Rousseau's The Social Contract. Yet on that book's cover is not a man, but a woman holding the scales of justice and a cat. The feline is hardly incidental. Rather, for Rousseau, a human's relations with cats were a kind of index for that human's sensibility towards freedom and tyranny. The Scottish philosopher James Boswell recalls being asked by Rousseau whether he was fond of cats, to which he replied that he was not. Rousseau then returned that the question was, quote, "my test of character, because those who don't enjoy cats have the despotic instinct of men," end quote. Rousseau then continued, "they do not like cats because the cat is free and will never consent to be a slave," end quote. In his 1796 allegory on the French Constitution, Pierre-Paul Proudhon presented a cat seated in the middle of the frame with a sidebar that reads, "A cat, symbol of independence, is seated at the foot of liberty." French revolutionaries were motivated by Rousseau, but what has drawn both Marx and Marxists to their story is the class struggle. We may follow cats through art, culture, scientific, and political discourses in which they become an index of the combustible politics of this dawning bourgeois age. Domestic felines were despised by certain vocal elements of the aristocracy, but certainly not all, and anyway, the whole point of the French Revolution was to do away with the aristocracy. Those same domestic cats were mostly embraced by an emergent bourgeoisie, who had launched an assault on the political power of rent-seeking nobles, those whom Marx refers to as parasites. And where were the proletarians in this struggle? It is their prospect and the prospect of their freedom that dominates Marx's critique. They had their own class resentments against domestic cats, who in many cases received better treatment from the bourgeoisie than they did. Yet they also advocated for forms of animal freedom distinct from an emerging bourgeois concern with what today we might call animal welfare. We see elements of the class struggle, which is also a cat struggle, in the work of court painter and founder of the Royal Academy of Painting and Arts, Charles Le Brun, who produced a remarkable series of human-animal hybrid studies, which included multiple species of felines. So this is his Lion Man. Quote, "Of course, there were noble characteristics to be found in the lion," writes historian Peter Salins of That Big Cat's Requisite Inclusion. In the lion, we see the lineages of the absolutist state, but we also note the features of men who were shaped like lions. They possessed the classical Greco-Roman lines of the busts and the rounded elements that predominate in facial feature and form, but not so the domestic cat, about whom Le Brun noted in his sketches around the animal's head a series of disparaging adjectives: obstinate, fearful, and wild. The cat likewise marks class longing and resentment in the new secular histories, such as those of Comte de Buffon, and this is his entry for the domestic cat. Buffon describes the domestic cat as, quote, "faithless," and says he, quote, "pays no respect to those who, being fond of beasts, keep cats for amusement. These animals are gentle and frolicsome when young, but they possess an innate cunning, which age increases and which education only serves to conceal." Buffon goes on to say, quote, "Cats are inclined to theft, and the best education only converts them into servile and flattering robbers. They know how to conceal their attentions, to wait, to watch, and to choose opportunities for seizing their prey. They fly from punishment and remain away until the danger is over and they can return in safety," end quote. In the language of the cat, Buffon was also describing an emerging proletariat. Indeed, the substitution of cat politics for class politics applied to perhaps the most radical Republican of the period, the man whose name is synonymous with the terror of the French Revolution, Maximilien Robespierre. Robespierre campaigned for universal suffrage and for the abolition of slavery. He supported the Women's March on Versailles and argued for an end to France's imperial wars. Under his leadership, the National Convention indeed did abolish slavery, including that of all French colonies, such as Haiti, and made those inhabitants citizens of France. Robespierre was described by Marx as, quote, the real representative of revolutionary power, end quote. But if Robespierre is routinely cited as the most radical of revolutionaries, he's likewise cited as the most feline. The feline-tinted denouncements came from onlookers in France, as well as those in two countries famous for never having had a proper bourgeois revolution, Germany and England. One German publication produced this image of the Jacobin leader, so Robespierre is on the top left, adorned by tigers. A few weeks after Robespierre's execution, the book A Portrait of Robespierre was published by one of his colleagues in the National Convention. Following a similar physiognomic logic to court painter Le Brun, this study of Robespierre noted, quote, people who like to find relationships between faces and moral qualities, between human faces and those of animals, have noted that Robespierre had the face of a cat. But the face altered its physiognomy. At first, Robespierre's face was the anxious but soft look of a domestic cat, then the wild look of a feral cat, and then the ferocious look of a tiger. From across the English Channel, the British chronicler John Adolphus noted in 1799 that, quote, the ferocity of Robespierre's gaze led an accurate observer to compare his general aspect to that of a cat tiger, end quote. Other revolutionary witnesses claimed that, quote, the tiger Robespierre has presided over a revolutionary politics that is, quote, a cadavero-feminocratic government and a tigracy, end quote. Indeed, it was in the discussion of Robespierre that Walter Benjamin introduced his conception of the tiger sprung, or the tiger's leap into the past, and his consideration of how revolutionary activity collapses past and present in order to transform present and future. Benjamin noted that, quote, for Robespierre, Roman antiquity was a past charged with the here and now, which exploded out of the continuum of history. The French Revolution thought of itself as a latter-day Rome. It cited ancient Rome exactly the way fashion cites a past costume. Fashion has an eye for what is up to date, wherever it moves in the jungle of the past. It is the tiger's leap, or the tiger sprung, into that which has gone before. It's the strength of the tiger's leap, up to 15 feet from a standing position, which may break through the ruling class's imaginative and material infrastructure. Unlike a tiger, however, the revolutionary cannot simply leap forward. Rather, she must leap back to retrieve a new history. And once she's secured it, she can begin to reorder the world. Through revolutionary violence and imagination, this oddly counterintuitive group of French vegetarians and would-be tigers began to craft a new society from the ruins of the old one. Feudal holdovers from around Europe, as well as an emergent bourgeoisie, looked on appalled. One English cartoon criticizing the French Revolution adorned the famous French guillotine with tiger images, which you can see on the guillotine's blade. On January 7, 1792, the London Times declared that, quote, the French have become set loose from all restraints and in many instances more ferocious than wolves and tigers, end quote. Indeed, at the height of that revolutionary year, 1793, the True Briton published an anonymous poem which both prefaced Walter Benjamin and exhorted fellow Britons to avoid the example of the French and their animalistic revolution. O Britons, to yourselves be true, despise the vile and leprous crew, from apes and tigers sprung, a monkey race, ferocious bred, that snapped the hand by which it fed, their deeds till now undone. Sometime between 1795 and 1806, the English painter George Stubbs produced an uncanny human tiger hybrid sketch, which might be said to rival those of Le Brun. Even the American founding fathers weighed in. Ensconced in the safety of their slaveholding republic, these New World bourgeois revolutionaries also noted animal features abroad. According to hater of the French Revolution, Hannah Arendt, American President John Adams, quote, was convinced that a free Republican government in France was as unnatural, irrational, and impractical as it would be over the lions, elephants, tigers, panthers, and bears at the Royal Menagerie in Versailles. But tell that to the Jacobins, who indeed liberated King Louis XVI's menagerie and invited the animals into their struggle. On August 11, 1792, a group of Jacobins marched to Versailles and declared to the menagerie's director that they had come, quote, in the name of the people and in the name of nature, to liberate beings that had emerged free from the hands of the Creator and been unduly detained by the pomp and arrogance of tyrants. The animals thus liberated, they marched the beasts back into Paris and stationed them at the Jardin des Plantes, which later became that perversion of revolution, otherwise known as a zoo. But tell it to the Marxists too, including Erich Hobsbawm, whose 1962, The Age of Revolution, one of the foremost Marxist studies of the period ever conducted, neglects the feline features of the French Revolution entirely, even as he wrote with his cat daily. This is his cat, Trisha. Hobsbawm and his study are well known for a different omission, of course, namely that of the French imperial possession Haiti and its own world-turning revolution. What we're now in position to realize is that attending to the former would have helped him attend to the latter, because in Haiti too, the revolution was one of tigers. And in Haiti too, we see a kind of tiger sprung. As a poem at the time recounted using Saint Domingo, the Spanish for Haiti. Saint Domingo's bloody journal tells of those who would be free, points to slaughter heaps diurnal. That is French fraternity. What has France for Europe done, sir? Set a savage tiger free. Arm the father against censure. That is French equality. It was Trinidadian Marxist C.L.R. James who, bearing his own feline name, the L stands for Lionel, was first able to represent the radical feline history of the Haitian Revolution. And everywhere James saw the tiger. Indeed, the tiger sprung, of which Benjamin used to refer to Robespierre in 1940, had already been revealed as a practice for writing and conceptualizing history in James's 1938 study of the Haitian Revolution, The Black Jacobins. For example, James recounts that when the revolution on the island reached its pinnacle and victory was imminent, rebel leader Toussaint Louverture declared to his forces, quote, "This is no longer a war, it is a fight of tigers. And it is no longer bravery I want from you, it is rage," end quote. When Louverture died in French captivity, Haitian revolutionary Jean-Jacques Dessalines succeeded him, and it was he who declared Haiti a free republic to the world. But while Louverture was alive, he was so feared and admired that James reports even Dessalines, the tiger, was afraid of him, end quote. So Dessalines, a tiger, was afraid of Louverture, who moved like a tiger. In James's study, he uses the language of the tiger both in appreciation of revolutionary fortitude and also with the same perceived antisocial associations that we see in France. For example, James describes the moment in which Louverture heard of Napoleon's order to reverse emancipation and restore slavery to Haiti. And he reports that, quote, "Louverture could not believe that the French ruling class would be so depraved. He could not admit to himself and his people that it was easier to find decency, gratitude, and justice in a cage of starving tigers than in the councils of French imperialism." One aristocratic chronicler on the island wrote in her memoirs, and this is of Dessalines, that, quote, "He is a bloodthirsty tiger, and one can say that without any metaphor," end quote. Her point is somewhat baffling, as Dessalines was clearly a human, but it does show the limits of metaphor as a figure of speech. This author desired to consign Dessalines to a world beyond humanity, a world that Marxists like Guevara and Engels have also desired to escape. A metaphorical operation, however, requires that a separation be maintained. When this person runs, she is a cheetah, necessitates a distinction between human and feline to expose the speed. She runs quickly like a cheetah. In fact, this memoir offers in reactionary form a lesson that James himself hints at in The Black Jacobins, but would not articulate fully until some years later in his notes on dialectics. To revolt, one must become a tiger, because in a revolution, one must leap. What James, what Benjamin, what our archive here instructs us is that the tiger is not a metaphor, but a dialectic, and dialectics are different creatures. They do not separate, rather they unite in contradiction, and in doing so, they make sense where none before was to be found. To move from one object to another, one state of being to another, one historical moment to another, one kind of society to another, requires a leap. James recounts how Louverture moved by tigerish leaps. He commanded a rebel army, which in fact dispatched French powers and became one of the largest successful slave takeovers in history. And indeed, for James, there's no more dialectic term than leap, which fittingly takes both noun and verb forms, and which first appeared to him in his analysis of Haiti through the language of the tiger. So I want to just close with a quick return to Marx, who does not include tigers in his voluminous prose, but certainly includes cats and lions, and certainly includes the figure of the leap. In Capital Volume 1, Marx writes, quote, "As the general conditions requisite for production by the modern industrial system have been established, this mode of production acquires an ability to leap and bound," end quote. Elsewhere, Marx writes that capitalist labor can, quote, "leap over the individual limit of humans," end quote. He reminds us then of capitalism's revolutionary power through its leap. Benjamin reminds us of the dialectic's counterpower through tiger leaps, and CLR James of the power of ideas to leap into material form. And now it is time that we as Marxists leap into a mode of interspecies critique for a different understanding of our past, our present, and thus our future. All right, thank you. I'm going to go ahead and end the screen share now.
Wonderful, thank you. So for any new participants, please keep your mic and video off for now and put your questions into the chat. Leigh, Claire, that was a really wonderful, thought-provoking talk, and I'm really excited to move now into our freewheeling roundtable discussion. Let me just briefly introduce the roundtable speakers, and bear with me because I'm doing all the cutting and pasting from the chat. My preparation to put it in before this started was all for naught because I guess no one can see it who hadn't joined. So as I'm speaking, I'm cutting and pasting the bios briefly for each person who will be part of the roundtable into the talk. So just give me a moment to do that, and then I will introduce them in just a second. That way you have them all in the chat, because I won't be able to read the entire bio, or we'd spend the whole time reading bios. Okay. Are the bios coming through for everybody? Yeah. Okay. Give me another half a second as I get the rest of the cut and paste. Usually we have lab people helping with this, but I couldn't ask them to do it at 3 in the morning. So you'll just have to bear with me as I do it myself. Here we go. Almost done. So we have a really exciting round table here ahead of us. We've got some wonderful participants who come from very different disciplinary backgrounds, and I think that will lead us into a conversation that will have unexpected findings for all of us. As we have the discussion, those of you who want to ask questions, you can keep putting them in the chat, and I will let you know when we're ready to open it up to everybody. And okay, almost ready here. I think I've almost got the last bio there. Hopefully I didn't miss anything as I scroll up and down here. All right. Zoom only lets you put a certain number of characters into the chat, so that makes it extra hard. All right. And I'm not going to put my bio in. I think that's a waste of time right now. So I'm Maya Kóvskaya, and I hope you all know me. Okay, I hopefully have not missed anyone in here. Okay, so without further ado, let me just tell you a little bit about our wonderful roundtable speakers. So biological anthropologist Barbara J. King is Emeritus Professor of Anthropology and a freelance science writer and public speaker, the author of 7 books, including How Animals Grieve, which has been translated into 7 languages, and her TED Talk on animal love and grief has received over 3.5 million views. She lives in Virginia, and she and her husband have rescued cats, which has finally, I guess, pushed her to succumb to the inevitable, which is writing a book about cats. This new project explores the science that debunks misconceptions about cats and also the ethics of living with cats, written from an anthropological and a personal lens for Princeton University Press. You can see more about her publications in the chat. Film scholar Yiman Wang is a professor of film and digital media at UC Santa Cruz. She's part cat and part human, which makes her a film scholar who works like a cat and who finds this world woefully inadequate. Hear, hear. In addition to other research themes, she's written on films because, well, there are cats. And there's a long list of those in the chat. She has published numerous books and articles and edited volumes on topics of eco-cinema and environmental media, Chinese cinema, independent documentary, ethnic border crossing, stardom, film remakes and adaptation. And there's many more publications, again, for you in the chat, as well as links. Literary scholar Amit R, I'm sorry, I'm mispronouncing it, is an associate professor of English and author of many books, including Post-Colonial Animalities, and a journal, a special issue called Planetary Solidarities, Post-Colonial Theory, the Anthropocene and the Non-Human, and many more, and is currently completing his 2nd monograph called Attunement to Others, the Anthropocene in Contemporary Indian Anglophone Literature, which I'm very excited about as well. Independent artist and researcher Terike Haapoja is a visual artist based in Berlin who also gave us a wonderful talk about a 1.5 years ago. Her work investigates the existential and political boundaries of our world with a focus on issues arising from the anthropocentric worldview of Western traditions. Animality, multi-species politics, cohabitation, loss, and repairing connections are recurring themes in Haapoja's work. Many international prestigious exhibitions have featured Terike's work, and Terike represented Finland at the Venice Biennale in 2013 with a solo show in the Nordic Pavilion, which is a huge achievement. And her work has been awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship as well in 2022, among many other awards. She was an adjunct professor at Parsons Fine Arts in NYU Steinhardt in New York till 2023, and now currently works as an independent artist and researcher. And we will be doing some exciting stuff together around Terike's Animal Capitalism project, which is very relevant to this today. So thank you so much for being the person who sparked this talk and got me excited to put it together and introduce me to Leigh. I would be remiss to not mention that. All right, so let me just move down and let's kick off our roundtable. To start it off, because I don't want to talk much during the roundtable, I'd like to just return to a few lines from the epilogue of Leigh Claire's expansive text. It's from towards the end, she writes about the significance of commodity in Marx's Capital and the narrative form that its work takes. And she writes, only at the end does the beginning make sense. And then invoking Kierkegaard's leap of faith, no tiger involved, but nevertheless a leap, and his argument that life can only be understood backwards, but must be lived forwards, Leigh Claire reminds us that it is true for our collective life as well, and for our understanding of what we are doing. This book takes us full circle to the deep stakes of its central project, when it rightly asks, have we actually arrived at a Marx for cats? Or has this book simply been mistitled? Have we in fact been reading Cats for Marx? Indeed, we have not yet seen how Marx or Marxism might be presented to cats, or how Marx's work or Marxism writ large might become for cats. And I love where she goes with this. She says, we don't know how Marx for cats is exactly, and we cannot know, unquote. That is, until we take our own forward-looking leap into an unknown future that has yet to unfold. A future that inhabits the promise of Marx for cats can only unfold through our collective reenactment or rematerialization of the human condition in ways that reclaim our shared animality, and in doing so, claim our grounds for interspecies solidarity. To that end, Leigh writes, one doesn't imagine post-capitalism, one materializes it. And through the act of materializing, the imagination changes. As the imagination changes, new relationships become possible. Nowhere is this promise more true than in the specter of an interspecies communism. We don't know what form it will take. Indeed, we cannot know until we collectively build and inhabit that form together. But we do know that a world of factory farms and global warming and zoonotic pandemics alongside untold human and other than human animal suffering is not it, unquote. So I would like to embrace this and further suggest that perhaps the new forms of relationality are the embodiment and enactment, the materialization of a new world. A world of multi-species gratitude, respect, egalitarianism, solidarity, liberation from human attempts at domination, from human attempts at domination that embrace our necessary co-becoming in ways that shed the world-breaking hierarchical dualism of our pernicious so-called master rationality, the inherent contradictions of which are perhaps nowhere more vividly instantiated than in the idea of ourselves as owners of our pets, whom we claim to and sometimes truly love, and yet refer to as property. A way of thinking that when applied to human animals, we know to call slavery. So perhaps today in our discussion, one of the things we might try to grapple with together are ways of enacting modes of egalitarian relationality that could materially instantiate a new ethos of interdependent, entangled coexistence that might help us take that critical leap that this book has so wonderfully helped us think about towards a radical re-inhabitation of a humanity that does not claim invidious, instrumental exploitation of others as the foundation of our shared world. I'm going to just turn the floor over to our wonderful speakers, and I ask everyone else to please keep your videos off for the moment. I'm going to put this on multi-speaker view. Let's see, and hide non-video participants, but you're all there in our thoughts, and we'll be excited to deal with your questions and engage with them after the roundtable has had a chance to discuss. So without further ado, I throw it open, folks. What would you like to talk about after this wonderful, stimulating presentation? Jump in.
Yeah, so thank you so much. This is such a thought-provoking and such a basically such a great object, great project that's really to my heart's liking. So I'm really excited. So I am also really intrigued by the idea of the leap, right? So Leigh, you spend a lot of time talking about how important this leap is, which we know is what cats specialize in doing, right? They can leap great distance and great height from the one point without any visible preparation, right? So, but at the same time, the leap, I think, Leigh, that you unpack so beautifully is also this this view of thinking about history, including the past and present, the future. So it is a whole conceptual framework for thinking about how Marxism, Marxist critique works in tandem with cats, what cats are really good at doing. So with this, then I have two questions. One is something that I think you already indicate at the end of your book, that is your focus. I see a cat there. At the end of your book, you indicate that your focus has been pretty much on the Western capitalism and the way that it's entangled with cats, right? I mean, Western capitalism and Marxist critique of Western capitalism. So then my question has to do, coming back to the question of the leap, that is, you did reference Mao as Chairman Mao now is the meme for Chairman Miao. And at the same time, obviously the Great Leap Forward campaign that was from the 1958 to 1961 I don't know, accidentally or intentionally utilizes the whole idea of the leap. But, tragically, in that case, if we imagine the Miao trying to attempt the leap forward, right? Because the goal is to overtake the imperialist Britain and the US. And in this case, Miao did not land on his feet. Because the whole leap resulted in this tragic Great Famine for 3 years, right? So then that got me to think about how do we think about this conceptual as well as actual leap in different contexts. In this case, it's in the name of socialism and in the name of anti-imperialism, right? But then that leap forward, spawns this whole host of problems that we are still reckoning with. So that is one question that has to do with the leap. And the other question that has to do with the leap is the way that I love about this conceptual framework is that it scrambles time. It scrambles this chronological, teleological understanding of history because, as you say, Benjamin's whole idea about the leap is to leap backward in order to think about what the present and future might be like. And also you say that, the whole project is about how the past could have been different and how the future could still be different, right? So I really love that kind of argument, that argument about the leap. But then the structure of your book, as you said at the end of the book, the structure of your book is very chronological, right? So I wonder if you were to, write a coda for the book, how you might complicate that backward leap and forward leap. And at the same time, cats also don't do the leap all the time. Sometimes they just stay still like a sculpture and they observe, right? They're totally tuned into their environment. So there is that kind of stillness, the history stand that still, the kind of Benjaminian reference again, right? The stand still of the history in combination with the multi-directional leap, how that might also, help us reshape the chronology of history. Thank you.
Maya, do you think it's best that I respond or we leave it open, or how do you?
No, just go as it feels good.
Okay. Thank you so much. That was actually quite a, I think, quite a poetic and generous engagement with the book. And, speaking of Mao, not the Great Leap Forward, but of the self-criticism, I do a self-criticism right at the end of the book where I say, there's two real problems with this book. One is the Euro-American archive, and the second is the sort of facile chronology. And that's not to excuse it, because I think those are the limits of me, sadly, and of sort of my mind. So in a certain way, I think what I attempted to do in the book is by following the sort of very accepted, I think very, very uncreative Marxist chronology of the longue durée. And I'm particularly thinking of books like, like Perry Anderson's From Feudalism to Antiquity, or Giovanni Arrighi's The Long 20th Century, as E.P. Thompson famously said, like one goddamn thing after the other, right? Like that's the sort of structure of history. So one of the things I'm attempting to do in the book is to satirize that and to play with that by asking what happens if you take that history not as a literal history, but as a narrative structure for writing stories, right? And I think that's something that Marxists haven't quite been willing to do. I mean, I think Walter Benjamin is probably the most creative of the bunch in terms of his sense of a sort of fancifulness about the construction of the archive and the movement of history. So in a way, I think in terms of the, how would you leap backwards? How would you leap otherwise? How would you leap in a direction that we can't imagine? You almost, Yiman, have answered your own question, which is to phrase it as a problem and to ask what this archive might allow us to do differently. What would be a different conception of time or history? That to me was the sort of limits of the thinking of the book. And so the reason I wanted to compliment you so much on your question is because I think it, it does what a real critical question does, which is open an avenue not yet explored, right? And so in the coda, when I do sort of self-criticize, I mean, my hope for this project would be that it would produce other animal Marxisms like this, these animals that dominate the Euro-American imagination of the exotic East, the tigers, the lion, these are animals, these are imperial fantasies, right? And much of this book is a sort of playing with the tension between the materiality and the history of those fantasies. But I absolutely, we need a Marx for cats from Southeast Asia or of Southeast Asia or of the global South, because that's where the archive has already come from, right? In terms of the Great Leap Forward, I think I do mention I think I do mention it in the book, but I certainly don't get into it. And I certainly don't have the expertise to do so now, other than to say that, yes, it was a leap. Yes, it was a tragic one, but I really thank you for those questions and for that creativity. I really appreciate that.
I wonder if I could pick up a little bit, Leigh, on what you mentioned about a narrative structure for stories in the context of, history and materiality. I finished your book a couple of weeks ago, and I'm still thinking about it. It was so delightful to read and mind-expanding to read. And I remember many things from it. One thing I've kept returning to in my mind is a particular image that you include. It's a 1902 painting that I believe is unattributed to a particular painter, but it's an image of a set of artists with easels set up at Jardin des Plantes, and they're in front of caged big cats. And the cages look pretty barren and pretty sterile. And the pictures that are being painted are of free-ranging cats in the wild. And that just is such, I think, in a microcosm, a symbol of so much of what we're talking about, because when we say that cats are workers, cats can be oppressed, I think part of what we're saying is not only that cats, do work and do labor, but that they're made to carry so much of our imagination and what we, sort of mirror onto them or pushed onto them. And there was a point in the book where you talked about how we have these twin logics of sentimentality and dominance. And in my work, I've been thinking a lot about how there are also twin illogics, if you will, of cats that are pampered and cats who are demonized. So the current sort of mode, and I'm thinking about this in a sort of tiger sprung context, is that, you have cats who live in homes and there's a tremendous amount of money spent on their care, their entertainment, their medical care. But there's this amazing meme now for cats as cold stone killers, cats as murderers. Cats are responsible for so much of the destruction that's going on in the environment and against wildlife. And the way that I see that is it's a displacement of a lot of human responsibility onto cats. Things, we've screwed up the environment and birds are dying because the wetlands are disappearing, or we're erecting buildings, or we're using lights all over the place. But we displace all of that onto cats in a way that I think is interesting. I was reading a book the other day written by a cat advocate, and she's talking about kitten development, and her goal is to give information about kitten development. And she headlines that section as how an assassin is born. This is just making cats do this incredible work. So I wanted to know if you could talk about that at all in the context of Tiger Sprung, or any other context that you'd like to take up.
Yeah, thank you for that. I'm a little behind on my cat memes, and so I hadn't seen the assassin ones. But yeah, when I read in the intro to my talk today when I said the book explores what kind of commitments are possible between Marxists and cats, and what kind of work cats have done for Marxists, and what kind of work Marxists might be able to do for cats. The work that I was referring to is sort of precisely the work of a material symbolism of both hope and failure. And of course, you're correct to note that pets in particular, since the mid-19th century, are imbued with this emotional cathexis that is just, it's so overwrought and so overbearing. And, the image that you refer to is called, I think it's called An Afternoon at the Jardin des Plantes. I mean, it has a particularly, it has a particularly harrowing history, not only because, as you point out, you have these bourgeois, it's both men and women, but you have this bourgeois art, casual artists painting these caged animals in scenes of freedom. And this is a sort of paradigmatic bourgeois imagination of nature, for lack of a better word. We don't have the right word yet. I mean, we don't yet have the right abstraction to refer to this kind of plant and animal otherness. But in the context of this book, that was where the Jacobins marched the king's menagerie to liberate them, right? And so now that gets turned into a zoo, precisely the sort of opposite of liberation. But I guess one thing that I do find hope for, and maybe this goes a little bit back to the previous question about how do you turn this, how do you leap into the unknown, and what happens if it goes wrong, and how do you turn a terror or a trauma into something else's? I do, when I give talks about the book, and the book is very playful, and the book is making jokes, and the book is inviting readers to have fun. And I think that's something we can talk about separately. What does it mean to write about animals with pleasure? But the book is also asking us to take seriously, what would it mean to have a kind of shared political and social world with animals? Not a world of memes with animals, not a world of cat toys and cat cafes, but a shared social and political world. And people, when I say that, not you guys, I mean, you're my colleagues, and there's a reason that I invited you to participate in the roundtable, but frequently people are like, is this woman absolutely crazy? Like, this has got to be the most insane thing I've ever heard. And they say that. And one of my responses to that is, if you journeyed back in time, if you take a tiger sprung back in time, let's say 250 years, and you could describe to people, in a future time, dogs and cats, rabbits, birds, I mean, they will go to daycare, they will have portraits taken, they will be referred to as children, they will be family members, they will be emotional subjectivities, but not political or social ones. People would have thought you were insane. I mean, the level of transformation of the animal and what the animal can embody and should be able to carry is absolutely as astounding as any of the other leaps of modernity, technological leaps, medical leaps, humanistic leaps, what have you. So why can't we imagine a similar site of radical otherness in a future in which it wouldn't be crazy to have a shared socio-political project with animals? Can we imagine it? No, I don't think we can imagine it, but we can begin asking questions about it. And we can certainly see, the transmutation of animal subjectivity and human to animal emotional cathexis over the course of history. It changes. It changes radically from the Middle Ages to the early modern and modern ages. The reason I include in the book some descriptions of animal trials. Animals were put on trial in the late and early modern ages. They were given counsel. They were held responsible, right? I mean, that seems, again, it seems surreal to us, and it usually didn't work out well for the animals, but they were invested with a kind of juridical subjectivity that was a serious contention of, or serious understanding of them as members of a social and economic world with whom humans had to contend in a way that I don't think we really have now. So that was a lot, Barbara, in answer to your question. I think there's so much more to say about what I understand is the sort of the paradigmatic bourgeois dichotomy between sort of sympathy or empathy and domination. And one thing that the Marxist project, if it means anything, is supposed to do is to say, you can't take an individual example in place of a structure. And people do that. Marxists do that with their pets. I mean, you hear it all the time, right? Well, of course, I love my own cat. I love her like my child. I mean, I'm saving for her college fund, of course. Do I eat animals? Absolutely. Who cares? What do I care if 9 billion chickens are slaughtered? It's not my business. They're not mine, right? So this is where you get. It's very similar to the sort of Victorian sympathies and racial sympathies and all of these forms of bourgeois solidarity that really ask you to disallow the structure of domination that produces the situation in the first place. And I think right now not cats, but pets, animals are paradigmatic of that. But it's an old paradigm. It really is an old paradigm.
Can I just jump in if I don't mind? I'd like to just tail off of some of the comments that were made and also kind of add a few more of my own. First of all, the playful nature of the book, just to kind of begin with a slight bit of mirth, that whenever I post about your book, I'll always get a couple of laugh reacts, like, oh, Marx for cats, right? I mean, when I post it on social media, which is one thing which I find interesting about this book overall, in the way in which it treats theory in a playful manner, but actually makes a lot of things very accessible, I guess. And what I liked, of course, was the way in which you used post-structuralism, especially the pleasure of the text, while still being very critical of it, but at the same time kind of trying, especially as someone working in animal studies or human animal studies, how to resuscitate the dialectic as a way of thinking. And just to go back to the question of the leaves, one of the things which I didn't notice, for instance, in your description of the contents were the intermezzos, which I found were very fascinating just in terms of the structure of the book, the 4 intermezzos about the lion-cat dialectic, the tiger-tiger, the cat and mouse, and of course the cat and the comrade, which I think is also, tailing off what Yiman was saying, while it is linear, right, but there are also these leaps, right, and these leaps actually allow you to bring those contradictions together and think about them in one unity. And just to go back also to what Maya was saying at the beginning, which was about how to imagine interspecies comradeship as opposed to interspecies friendships, interspecies, kind of solidarities and so on. I love that last section about Lenin and his cat in chapter 8. To read out that section where they offer us and the statue, they offer us a conceptual and material invitation to meet their own comrades and enemies and to chart a different understanding of the bestiary that is nature. Maybe not yet. And these two comrades gesturing towards an open future which they'll shape together. I mean, for me, again, just like the coda, I think it does capture a lot about these possibilities that are not yet, but very well could be. Now, one other question I would like to kind of pose here, and I wanted to pose this to you at the ACLA, and I actually went for the plant and animal. You're not there. That was kind of like interested in hearing more about the Rosa Luxemburg. But I just wanted to go back to page 16, which is where you talk about the radical, and especially radical bestiary. And it's kind of struck me because I was teaching Richard Powers's Overstory. And there too, there's a little section there which talks about the etymology of the word radical. And I used that to basically think about the structure of the text as well. But I think it's very fascinating that here's where a certain kind of feline imaginary, if you may, can intersect with an arboreal one to open up other possibilities. I'm just going to read this out and I'll ask you to respond to it, right? Finally, mine is a radical bestiary. This overused adjective must be situated in its present context. It refers from the Latin radic, for root, a botanical etymology. Marx identified, but whose larger meaning he somehow missed when he argued, to be radical is to go to the root of the matter. For man, the root is man himself. Roots appear radical and trace their genesis underneath a multiplicity of potentials, some of which lie beyond the scope of quote-unquote man. Another subterranean past of radical comrades and their cats, and the radical cats and their comrades has existed for centuries, and we need only to excavate it. For me, this was such an interesting moment where animal and plant come together, actually in terms of not simply as a metaphor, but as a kind of concrete materiality to basically think about alternative possibilities for the future, which is something I really admire your book for. And I've been, that passage about James and Benjamin is something it was absolutely a favorite of mine, which I've been kind of talking about. But I thought this interesting connection between arboreality and let's say a feline history is something which remains a bit immanent in your work, but I would love to hear more about it.
Amit, thank you for that. First of all, I want to apologize for not being at ACLA. My mother got sick and I had to go to Virginia, and I thought the conference would announce it, so I'm sorry. I hope the panel was good. Yeah, the panel that he's talking about was a 3-day panel at the ACLA conference, not on plants or animals, but plants and animals. And Rosa Luxemburg herself was quite a botanist, and she was incarcerated during World War I. And I write a lot about that in the book, because she really, in this moment, she turned to plants. She made sketches and books of the few plants that grow in a Berlin prison yard. But she also had this sort of intense comradeship with the birds that flew over the prison yard and the working animals in the prison yard. That said, I think your point about to be radical is to go to the root, and sort of using that idea to exfoliate a kind of plant animal bestiary is amazing, and it honestly is not something that I thought of in the way that you are thinking of it. So I guess I would like to thank you for that, and again also just feel a sort of moment of theoretical excitement in thinking about ways that these emergent disciplines of arboreal humanities or animal studies, whatever we want to call them, might find a kind of cohesion and an archive that we haven't yet expected. And I think like your ability to do that from an archive that I found but wasn't aware of myself, I think is quite amazing. And honestly, you know, now that you mention it, and this is why I want to really tell you how thankful I am, I can think of other instances in the book where one could draw that out, right? Not only Luxembourg, but also the you know, Oswald, the sort of the radical vegetarians that have been, on the one hand, had this sort of budding animal comradeship. I don't think it's in full form, and I don't think vegetarianism necessarily equals what we're all sort of talking about and looking for. But I do think there are overlaps, and I think the idea of roots and of plants and of farming and of the soil might be a very fertile, no pun intended, place to look. So no, thank you. That's wonderful. And
Terike, you want to
if,
jump in? Oh, sorry.
sorry. No, I just was gonna say that I don't know if now is the time. I see that Terike has her hand up, but I'd also really be happy to discuss the playfulness, the snarkiness, the fun of the book and what it's doing for critique. But let's go to Terike first, maybe.
Yeah, thank you from me also. I really appreciate the incredibly rich research and the wittiness and the way in which you know, like make fun with the tradition in a way that I think makes the reading really, really enjoyable. It's really beautifully written book, and it's really a pleasure to read. I was thinking of cat as a particular animal, and of course my own work is not really about cats, so this has been like really exciting to see this incredible way in which the history of Western civilization is so inspired by feline figure, or the symbolism of the feline. And I was thinking that in the kind of history of capitalism, cat is very particular, or the felines are very particular animals, that they're very atypical animals in many ways. And if you think of just like that, the ownership of bodies, starting from owning your own body and then owning other bodies, is the kind of like a core feature of this kind of property relations are the core feature of capitalism. And then cats are kind of an anomaly in this sense under capitalism, because they don't really enter the stage as commodities, but they also don't really enter the stage as pests, not the same way, at least, as many others. So they, in a way, they always tend to represent or be represented as beings who own their own body in some way. They're not workers, they're not an object, but they're also not capitalists. So I sense that, the way it seems that the cats always sort of represent a sovereign in some way in this imaginary. So it's a very different, very particular animal figure in this economic imagination. While at the same time, in the history of capitalism, of course, you have chickens and pigs and whales and beavers and horses who are like embodying the making of capitalism, capitalist society, and also embodying the property relations in the ideology of property relations in their own body in a different way. So I guess my question is sort of like this position of cats on the one hand, like how do we leap from cats to other animals when their positionality to production is so different? And if I like to think of like class as just a relationship to production, which kind of opens it up to thinking of class as a multi-species relation, that is just about how you are in relationship to production. And so, yeah, this leap, like how do we leap from this narrative of like cat imaginary, where it seems that it's more like intellectual work that they're doing, while a lot of other animals are doing being the beasts of burden, and also human animals doing the like literal physical labor. So how do we, if we want to build like a movement, how do we make this leap? And then maybe just to kind of like another question that you touched upon a little bit, this notion of a multi-species political world. I could imagine that it's easier for us to think of a multi-species world when we think of cats or companion animals, but then when it comes to food animals or animals that are animalized really heavily, it becomes more difficult. And I don't think socialism as such would necessarily be a multi-species structure. It could be as exploitative to non-human animals as any. So it just depends on like what kinds of relationships do we assign to creatures in relationship to production, and how do we understand them ontologically also? Are they means of production? Are they laborers? Like what is, so maybe that's also another, but maybe the question of like how do we just maybe to think of what also like what other kind of intellectual work would other animals do, like what kind of intellectual work in the narratives, in the theories of Marxism or in the theories of left discourse do whales do, or also not to always reduce them to their material basis of like what is their, this is like a cloud of response / questions, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Thank you. No, it's very rich, and I think it's actually not unrelated to how I ended my response to Amit and talking about the pleasure and the fun and the and the sort of playfulness of the book, which of course cats are playful, but most animals are ludic, whether it's cats or dolphins or monkeys or what have you. And the answer to the question, how do we do this? Not, I mean, do you do it for another animal? Like, what is the sort of formula? I wish I knew. I don't know. I mean, a question I do often get asked is, what other animals did you find in your research with whom you could have written this kind of history? Or is there another species laying fallow waiting for this history? The ones that most often I get asked about are dogs, unsurprisingly, companion animal, as you said, birds, kind of companion animal, kind of not. Horses, again, kind of companion animal, but obviously a commodity, a very powerful animal, a workhorse, right? These are economic animals. And yes, I absolutely think that the sort of like capaciousness of the approach that I tried to take and the playing with the narrative form could be, you could do this with other animals, and you could do it in another region. As I said, I can't tell you how excited I would be to get a Marx for Cats of Southeast Asia. And I hope that somebody will be inspired to do that. But I think that there's this real problem. I mean, you yourself alluded to it in your question, where you said, okay, it's one thing to do for companion animals, but like, how do you ask somebody to see a chicken as a potential interlocutor or a potential comrade or a friend, or a pig or a cow? And I think that when I first became, very interested in thinking about animals and capitalism, but because of my own cat and my relationship with my own cat, one of the things that I realized is to even discuss this in most political economic contexts would be to risk being seen as making a joke, right? Like, you can't possibly be serious, right? You can't possibly imagine a sort of multi-species comradeship with a group of chickens in a factory farm. And so part of like the fun and the provocation of the book is sort of to say, like, you thought this was a joke, like, I'll give you a joke, like, it is a joke, but like so many jokes, it's real, right? So part of what this book is trying to do is really satirize academic writing and really satirize an academic monograph, right? And say, like, well, what kind of knowledges are we producing, and for whom, and for what kind of politics? And I guess I feel that I'd be interested to hear how other people feel, but a sort of didactic or pedantic or overly pedagogical invitation to people to think seriously about animals, it doesn't seem to work, right? In the sense of building forms of comradeship. And most of the things, I mean, not these arcane stories that I tell in the book, but most of the things that you would tell somebody in terms of inviting them into a political struggle with animals, they would already agree with, right? I mean, no one is going to stand up and say, I'm a fan of factory farming. I think animals should be tortured. Let's just carry on as is. Everything is going well. But they also won't be disturbed out of that. So I was trying to find a way, a writerly way, a pedagogical way to produce like a different scene of encountering animal knowledges and encountering animal histories. Will it work? Does it work? I don't know. I think that we will have to see. And I think what you said at the beginning of your comments about cats are such an anomaly in terms of economic history. I completely agree with that. And I think one of the things that the book shows is they're not only an anomaly in capitalism, they're an anomaly in many economies, right? And so that's why I begin with the sections on the Middle Ages and feudalism, because they're an anomaly there too. But the form of the anomaly is quite different. But the fact of the anomaly seems to seems to maintain. I do just want to mention, I don't know if people know this book. Do you know this book, Floating Coasts, by Baishya Demuth? I'll just put it in the chat. It's a history of the Bering Strait as animals, particularly whales and walruses, were, destroyed, hunted. I mean, really rendered extinct from that area by industrial capitalism in the 19th century, 19th and 20th century. And she looks at both the imperial Russian management of the Bering Strait, the 19th century American management of the Bering Strait, the 20th century Soviet management of the Bering Strait, and the 20th century American capitalist management of Bering Strait. And what she finds, and this is to your point about would they really do better under a socialist order? No, I don't think so. I really don't think so. There's also an amazing book that I'm sure some of you know called Communist Pigs. I'll just type it in the chat, about the East German pork industry. Oh my God, I mean, what an absolute, like, literal shit show in so many ways. But no, I don't think there's a prescribed politics, and I don't think there's a prescribed history in terms of writing. And I think, that's what's so exciting for all of us as scholars at the moment, and writers and artists, in being able to sort of ask questions about animals and political solidarity with them that really haven't been asked, certainly in many academic spaces. I think more so in art spaces, but I don't think so much in academic spaces.
Yiman, you want to jump in?
Yeah. I just wanted to say that it's really inspiring. And I think if we look at animal extractivism, it is all over the place and accelerated speed. So animal extractivism under socialism in China is something that I'm working on now. But I do also want to return to the dimension of the pleasure, maybe also some silly elements of the pleasure. Right? I use silly in a very serious way because I'm thinking about, there's a book called Memes to Movements where the author talks about being silly and serious at the same time. And then Jack Halberstam also has a book on the failure of queer art where they talk about the silly archives. So I think it is really interesting for us to take silliness, silly pleasure seriously. So then my question specifically has to do with also the female association with the cats, right? The two examples that really stand out for me, Claire, in your book is, one is obviously Rosa Luxemburg. The other one is the Paris Commune woman who then was exiled to, I don't remember which country, South Africa, is it?
Sorry, New Caledonia in the South Pacific.
New Caledonia.
Michelle. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So those two instances really stand out for me because they both write to their cats, and I'm like, wow, how inspiring! Maybe someone can write a book about, So you have a bestiary genre. So maybe there is also lurking somewhere an epistolary genre for cats, right? But again, the question is that what I really enjoy about these women and their relationship to their cats is not only the intimacy, but also that kind of unruly kind of intimacy as a defiance of the normative requirement on them, right? So basically they have to say, well, yes, I enjoy, just talking about my cats, right? And then sort of in defiance of people who will say, well, there are so many other things you should be caring about. Why are you talking about cats, right? That itself is so just, so basically that raises the question for me. We have been talking about the personal is political for for as long as I can remember, right? But here it sort of goes to a different level in thinking about feminism, thinking about feminist interspecies intimacy, and thinking about how that itself opens up new venues of understanding politics, and basically resisting the stigmatization of these kind of ostensible sentimentalism or sentimentality as irrelevant to politics, right? So I found that to be really powerful, and would love to hear you maybe comment a little bit more if you wish.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think so too. And I think, in the cases that you cite, the Louise Michel and the Rosa Luxemburg, they're interesting because even there, the trajectories of the relationships to the cats are quite different. So Louise Michel grew up on a farm, was a communard, led the women's committee for the aid of the wounded, but was quite politicized and understood her own politicization to come from watching suffering of animals in her childhood, in her teenagehood, working on this farm. She was then found guilty of crimes against the state during the Paris Commune and sent to exile to New Caledonia. And when she left, first of all, she organized in New Caledonia. She did write letters to her cat, but she organized in New Caledonia. And so that also was a site of, decolonization. She organized with the indigenous people against French colonization of the South Pacific. But then when she left, when she got out of her punishment, she actually attended the one of the first, if not the first, World Vegetarian Congresses in 1890, and she started moving away from organized politics, and the scale of her politics was sort of she got into education, another sort of feminized employment scheme. I mean, one of the few that she had. She ran an anarchist school and got involved with vegetarian politics. Rosa Luxemburg takes a radically different path. There's no sentimentality there. There's no longing for the sentimentality. And I mean, to me, as I said in the books, I mean, the talk's introduction, she's really the most tragic figure of the book, right? Because the pleasures, the joys, the silliness, if you want to say. I mean, I think we could, in both cases, also use an idea of queerness or start thinking about an idea of queerness. It never becomes a politics for her, even as it's so much a part of her life. It really does for, I think, Louise Michel. And then, of course, when Luxemburg when she's killed, when she's assassinated, by the Free Corps, the sort of proto-fascist German brown shirts. One of the insults, they have this conception of communists, sex workers, women, and cats. This is sort of a grouping of potential subversives or actual subversives. What is being subverted? The state, the family, heterosexuality, the marriage form. So she's, if you know about her life, she's certainly victim to that in so many ways, even before her, her imprisonment and then her murder, both of which are grisly enough. So I think one of the things that I would say that I hope the book tries to do is show that there's no one trajectory for this kind of feline comradeship. And I think as Amit was saying, there's no even one species trajectory, because it can often go into other species, plants, animals, so on. But yeah, the comment that you make about the association with femininity, I mean, what's so impressive about the representation of cats in Western culture, really, 1,300 years old, is not just their ability to subvert economic order, but their ability to conspire with women. And when you think, how much the cat has changed, and gender has changed, and the woman has changed. I mean, these are such radically different terms, and yet you know, the cat and the witch from the 12th century. So I don't know if that's an answer to your question, but I'm very glad that you sort of picked up on that, because I think it's an absolutely crucial theme. And I think it's one that I guess, you know, I would hope is in a sort of, in a future interspecies site kind of pried away from its over association with the feminine. I mean, it's kind of a hysterical association, and turned instead into like a sort of non-binary, a queer, I mean, a sort of truly open dialectic form of identitarian relationality.
Thank you.
I'd like to ask you something about playfulness, because I think we should continue with that maybe just a little bit. But I just want to make an aside comment that I think it's a really ripe time for Marx for octopuses in particular, because we're at this inflection point right now. There's a number of us, large collectives of people, really working against octopus farming, working against octopus as the next biomedical laboratory animal, and so forth. So I think there's all kinds of wonderful chances for sort of embodying political struggle with octopuses. But I agree with you very strongly that a sort of pedantic book about joining together in political struggle for animals doesn't reach people in the way that a book that's got both seriousness and substance and humor does. So this is a much less theoretical question. It's a simple question, but I want to ask it anyway. You know, I work at the sort of junction of these sites of commodification of cats, like cats that are kept in biomedical laboratories, cats that are bred in these really terrible commercial ways. And I don't want to be pedantic all the time, and I don't want to be grim all the time. But how can you talk about that process? I mean, is it literally like an intentionality to say, I'm going to inject some playfulness, or is it more sort of organic, or how does it work for you?
You know, it's such a good question. I can think of two ways to, maybe three ways to answer it. But I'm from Virginia, Barbara, and I grew up next to a cow pasture, like literally next to it. And I saw a lot of suffering there, and that you know, I got my school involved. I mean, there was one particular calf that was just left to die, or like right at the bus stop where the children were, and everyone is on board for the suffering. No one wants to watch a calf suffer. Everyone's on board for that. I'm sure no one wants to watch a cat suffer. But again, it's this problem of the one-to-one, like, well, that calf shouldn't suffer, but whatever. There are 100 million other calves, like, let them go. And so that has really stayed with me for a long time, because in different moments of my life, I've tried to get people involved in animal rights. And I think I just haven't, you know, as a teenager, as a college student, I don't think I have been that successful. But, you know, Emma Goldman, who said she's like a cat, she always lands on her feet. You know, she has this line it's often considered a throwaway line, but she says, let me see if I get it right. If I can't dance, I don't want to be, I only want a revolution where you can dance, or if I can't dance, I don't want to be part of your revolution. But I mean, a kind of like pleasure and joy that I really think are elements of a politics, of a community, right? Not even a politics, a solidarity, a community. And so one of my larger projects, it's something I'm working on now, in this book that I'm writing now called Fake Work. I'll be doing a conference on this in New York in October on Marxist humor, a night of Marxist humor. Like, what would it mean to be to do Marxist stand-up comedy, for example? I mean, there are few people who have as low a tolerance for humor and pleasure as doctrinaire Marxists. And it's so sad, because I really agree with the political economic argument, and that has really formed so much of the intellectual basis of my life work. But what I can't get on board with is the dourness. And it's not, I mean, the thing about Rosa Luxemburg, it wasn't just that her comrades criticized her for giving meat to her cat that could have gone to feed a comrade. It was that she got pleasure from it. And this was a site of mutual joy. And, you know, how you find a space for pleasure with, you know, cats in medical research facilities who no one wants to look at, no one wants to know about that, no one wants to be involved with that, right? I mean, and for good reason. I'm sure it's absolutely horrific. I don't have an answer. I do think that for me, humor and joy, both in the writing process and the reading process, has become a more and more important part of the work that I want to try to do as an intellectual and as someone really engaged in political economic critique who really sees the limits of it as well, right? Like, why isn't it more popular? Why, I mean, not even popular amongst, like, you know, your average man on the street interview, but among the academy, right? So yeah, I mean, I think also this book was written under such strange circumstances. It was written mostly during the pandemic, during the first wave of the pandemic, during which I also had a child. And I think I sort of thought, my God, you know, this could just be the end. I mean, once the child was born, I'm like, maybe I'll never sleep again. That has actually proven to be largely true. But maybe this is just the end of it all. And like, if I'm going to write another book, I want it to be a site of fun, because I think that's as politically effective as didacticism, if not more effective, right? So.
That's a wonderful point. Before we open it up to any questions from the audience, because I know there might be a couple people who have, I know Amit's had his hand up and Terike has had their hand up for a long time. So maybe you guys can quickly each make a quick comment, and then we'll go straight to see if anybody from the audience wants to make a comment or ask a question.
I just wanted to quickly add on to the
Yeah.
pleasure and joy question, but the final leap you make in your book, which is the salto utopico, right? Which is the yet unimagined possibility. And the work and the labor involved in that is also to take a lot of pleasure in the friendships and the comradeship that we draw. I mean, Rosa Luxemburg's letters are so much about the pleasure that she takes in her friendships, not just human, but also non-human, so to speak, in some ways. And maybe that joy, that pleasure, those simple things which come out in those letters are precisely the building blocks for that salto utopico. I mean, I love that last leap that you make, inviting us to think about the future in that sense. So thank you.
Yeah, just a quick comment. I also totally agree with the humor and joy part, and art is a great place also to do, and the kind of creative project that you've done. I think it leads to, it's like, come here, make more art. It's you can be crazy, and yeah. But I wanted to comment actually about the notion of the notion of feminized, domesticated cats, sort of like kind of freeing the cat, you know, freeing the cat symbolically from the domesticated. I'm thinking of like what Nancy Fraser calls domestication, in the sense of like care work, all the social reproduction work being, you know, but like freeing that work also in the sense of liberating the sovereign from, because now cats are really commodities. And I mean, I heard this, read from the newspaper that now the vet in Finland, where I'm from, the vet costs are so expensive that it's cheaper to just, you know, throw the cat away or the pet away and you know, and buy a new one, which is kind of what happens to all commodities, is that they become completely disposable. And this is what kind of starts to happen to pets as well, that the way in which pet animals are commodified is such that we kind of they have this symbolic, you know, value, but then in reality they're pretty much becoming commodities, like disposable commodities. So how to free the animal? Then I'm thinking there is actually one place where there is like quite militant Marxist animal theories, which is of course the militant animal liberation movement, where a lot of that folks is like they're anti-capitalist or they're anarchist, but they're definitely not in for the system, and they're militant and they're going in and they're freeing the animals, and then everybody goes crazy because you can't free the animals. Like you can't, let the cat go out because it kills all the birds, So there is this sort of havoc that starts to happen when we actually free the animal and let the sovereign run free, and we're sort of terrified of it. And I think also the sort of eco-socialist, maybe the Marxist, I don't know so much, but like there is a tendency to try to figure out, well, how should we do it? We have to have a plan. We have to write everything down, and then we have to figure out the relations and who gets to be a person and who doesn't get to be a person. But the kind of anarchy of what happens when you free the cat, the cat out of the bag, like you say so many times in the book, is like that anarchy. And there's something about that I think we also maybe just need to, I don't know, celebrate that we don't know what it's going to be crazy, and it's probably another kind of violence can erupt, or like things that we can't imagine start to happen when we let the cat out of the bag. And then maybe that kind of solidarity with the militant animal liberation movement, where they're very vilified and feminized and dismissed as, the cat, animal rights, girls and so on. So I'm just calling for like a solidarity from the eco Marxist or political ecology for the animal liberationists, not only the animals, but also the animal liberationists, because they're really doing the serious militant anti-capitalist work with the animals, who then go crazy.
That is a terrible story about the cats in Finland, or it's
I think it's everywhere.
It's quite amazing. I don't entirely know what to say about it. But yes, I think I also agree with you that art is a place where we could foment these kinds of things. And I guess I do just want to maybe mention like a few texts that I think people might be interested in. This book, Half Earth Socialism, I don't know if people know this, just came out 2 years ago, I guess, maybe. Also quite imaginative. Also not entirely playful, but there is, when you ended your question, Terike, and you said eco-socialism. I mean, within eco-socialism, there's really a sort of holdover of the best eco-socialist learns how to dominate nature to get the most from it, right? This sort of eco-modernism, and so we have to find a way to have an eco-socialism that is inviting and not dominating. Again, I don't know what it would be. Certainly not what's going on in Finland with the vets, but also Finland. I mean, you have these amazing. I'm sure you have a public health insurance plan. Why don't animals get health insurance? That's a genuine question.
I think
actually a
they do,
wonderful
but I think the
question.
question with the commodification of animals, I don't think it's, I mean, they didn't tell people to throw the animals away, but I think it's just the way in which capitalism works is that it creates, it creates these disposable commodities, and legally animals, companion animals are commodities, and I think it just happens everywhere. But yeah.
Maybe I can jump in. I've seen a couple of really interesting threads sort of, but I probably can't pull all together because it's been too many and too rich. But as we get like 9 minutes before we have to leave here, thinking about how, like, what is the work that has to be done to transform a living sentient being that has its own subjectivity, its own life, its own purposes, its own value, into a fetishized commodity, for example, or embedded within particular kinds of social relations, right? And how it is that we have managed to effectively alienate the animality of the human from the human condition so profoundly, when an understanding of the human as animal was an important part of all kinds of animist beliefs from myriad different indigenous civilizations that had a totally different understanding of other than human animals and plants and other kinds of life forms, rivers, glaciers, etc. Not only living beings, but all kinds of other natural entities and beings that with which we always necessarily coexist. And so I'm just thinking about the work now of misrecognition. And I'm thinking about the question about the cats in the laboratories, or the pigs in the factory farms, or all the sites where like extreme horrors are enacted, and what kind of work has to be done to enable a human being to do that work, engage with that work, allow that to happen, and not look at oneself and say, I'm a monster. Not to hate oneself for allowing so much horror to continue. So what happens, like, what is the sort of locus of this misrecognition, and how does one undo it? And then I'm thinking about, we've all been talking about what would the grounds for a multi-species politics be? What would that really even look like, right? Not, little animals with transcoders doing a UN-style assembly and voting. Would be something else. And for that, I've been thinking for about 10 years now with someone who would have rolled over in her grave at the way I'm using her work, but Hannah Arendt. Because Hannah Arendt was terrified of animality of the human and biological necessity and the needs of the body and all that was animal. And even as she recognized that one of the conditions of the modern world of modernity was earth alienation away from the natural world, and how humans had sequestered ourselves in a particular way that was actually toxic and devastating. And yet she still decried everything that had to do with animality, and all those got lumped into the domestic sphere, and then the serving the needs of the body as being outside the realm of the political. And so against her wishes and her intentions, I see her idea of the space of appearance, which she writes about in The Human Condition, and the space of appearance, which is the proto-political site of seeing and being seen as sharing natality, mortality, we live, we die, and in between we have to live together, coexist on this finite earth where we are all different, a plurality of the condition. Now, if we were to open that space of appearance conceptually to other than human beings, that would require us to, of course, assume that other than human beings can speak in some form or another. So not only can the subaltern speak, but can the other than human speak? And I would say resoundingly, we all know that they can. But the question of what constitutes speech, and how we measure what is speech, and then how we come to understand the communicative practices and articulations and enunciations of others. How do we think about that? We know that there have been horrible experiments like Project NIM in the 60s and 70s, where animals were taught sign language, and then, they don't measure up to the way humans speak, so they're not really sentient, so they're not really intelligent, so we can treat them like disposable trash and commodities and objects for who exist for our use and our pleasure. And so maybe part of what we need to do in thinking about a multi-species politics is to reevaluate how we understand speech itself. And so what I don't know if this is helpful, but in thinking about how do we move beyond engaging with animals merely as a foil for thinking of ourselves, right? How do we not only look at the history of the way animality has been described, the figures of animals, and what that allows us to do, the work it allows humans to do in our misrecognition, as well as in our conditions of solidarity. And how do we start to attune ourselves, as I think Amit's book might be about? I'm thinking of Goffman's attunement, for example, to adjust the way we live in relation through a kind of space in which we allow and we seek to see the appearance of others in what Tom Van Doren calls, their taking them seriously in their otherness, or what Val Plumwood talks about as not trying to holistically unify other than human animals into this like, we're all really just the same kind of being, and our person is the same, and our subjectivity is the same. That erases what's important and exceptional about every single species, but in a way that allows the radical alterity of being, through which the individual subjectivities of individual beings actually, and beings not just as species, but as a species that contain massive heterogeneity, can manifest as I would call performative speech acts. And learning to read and hear and listen to the performative speech acts of the ways in which the embodiment of their being and modes of communication of other than human animals and plants now, I guess, as well, might be a first step towards getting rid of some of this misrecognition that allows us to do horrific things and not see what we're doing, not think what we're doing, as Hannah Arendt would say. And I was just thinking about the way in which seeing the face of the other or being seen by the other has been so important in so much political philosophy and philosophy. You know, Levinas with the, you know, the dog, and Derrida talking about being seen by the cat, you know, when he's naked. And then I was thinking of Eduardo Kohn, who's working with indigenous peoples in Latin America, and he talks about the runa puma, the human, the personhood of the puma, that indigenous people know to sleep on your back, so that when the jaguar or the puma is walking around at night, they can see that you're a person because they see your face, and so they won't eat you. So maybe part of how we see the personhood of others starts with trying to see them not as flattened, undifferentiated sort of beings built off the template or the referential, what is it? Sanjawu, I don't even know how to say it in English. How do you say Sanjawu, Iman? We need to decenter ourselves from being the point of reference for understanding what is speech, and what is an enactment of the intrinsic, irreducible, you know, exceptional being of any individual, any being, species or individual otherwise. And maybe continuing to think about what that politics might look like in everyday practices through fun, through joy and play. And with my cats, I call it kit intimacy, right? Modes of intimacy with other beings takes us a long way in the radical empathy work we need to do to stop misrecognizing, to see the being of another when they look back into your eyes and they see you. And then that leads me to thinking about when Coco, the gorilla, right before she died, they created a video of her signing about climate crisis. And she said, I am nature, nature sees you, humans, like hurry up before it's too late. Maybe if we started to become human under the gaze of a judging nature made of diverse and myriad different beings, we might not be able to misrecognize what we do and have to learn to be different in our humanity. Maybe that's the place we actually have to start. So leaving that open. Is there anything that anyone from the audience has to say? There were no comments, questions, so I threw one in, but if there are now.
I think
are two,
Paul Romano, yeah.
Paul,
two
do you want to
questions
say
in the Q&A.
anything?
Yeah, there were two questions from Paul Romano. I think I sent it to you.
Paul, can you jump in? Do you want to jump in? Or I can read a question if you have one. Paul, I didn't see it earlier. Paul, do you want me to read your question for you, or do you want to read it out yourself? By the way, Paul's one of my most brilliant classmates I've ever studied with, so I'm really excited that he's here. I hope he's still here.
He's here, I see.
Paul, do you want to read out your question, or should I read it for you? I often read for the audience. It's up to you.
Please, you go ahead and do it, please.
Okay, I have to find it again. So Amit, let me see. You copied it. Where is it? Oh, sorry. Okay, here we go. So Paul, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. I mean, Maya, if you can see them now, you please go ahead.
Oh no, I don't care who reads it, really. You want to read it, Iman?
No, I was gonna too, just
okay.
because
I just found it. Okay, so Paul, who also is a Santa Cruz person, Iman, by the way, originally, and a Berkeley person with me. So Paul asks, how did you decide what would count as a cat? Wow, that's a great question. And are there any vertebrates for which solidarity is a concept less apposite than cats? Is that part of the point? Is that part of the point for you? So Leigh Claire, maybe we can give you the last word. It is 4:01, so you can answer as quickly or as long as you wish. And then everybody after that, I guess we'll have to say thank you and goodbye. Thank you, Paul.
Yeah, thank you for the question. How did I decide what would count as a cat? You know, I think one of the guiding problems and opportunities of any social movement is how you decide what counts as anything, right? How do you decide what counts as a person? How do you decide what counts as a voting subject? How do you decide what counts as a romantic relationship? How do you decide what counts as a child? And so one of the things the book tries to do in its various sort of intermezzos, these short, very philosophical chapters between the chapters, is really use cats to stage a troping of what a Marxist category is. How does Marxism produce its categories, and what allows change within the category, and what change is so radical that it then violates the integrity of the category. So I was guided that's the larger philosophical explanation. The smaller one is I was guided by my archive. As I mentioned, I wrote this during the COVID pandemic. So I wasn't really leaving my house. And, what I found that predominated in a certain moment, I tried to use as a member of the feline category, to which I understand it as a political category. But that really changes in different historical moments. And I don't think there's any sort of historical specificity, even with the body of the cats itself. I mean, material histories change as surely as intellectual ones and social ones. So I think it's actually a pretty flexible category. But again, I think what I'm interested in is less the coherence to the category than a study of what categorical coherence is and could be, and what that means for social movements. And I know we are out of time, and I just want to thank everybody so much for your comments. Wow, this has been such a rich discussion, and I would love to. I don't know if this is possible, but I'd love to try to remain in contact. And I don't know if through AMOR MUNDI you have sort of an ongoing forum for such discussions. But I've learned so much from all of you, and I appreciate so much the time that you guys took to read the book and to produce these amazing comments.
Well, let me just say thank you to all of you. And again, I know some of you really do have to jump off right now, and we can't just keep going, but we are having more conversations soon. We'll be doing something with Terike's project on animal capitalism. Barbara and I have been talking about doing something about the octopus question, which I think is also very urgent and important as part of this humans and other animals under the Capitalocene, and many more. I hope that all of you will be giving talks about us at some point about your work in relation to the themes that we're working on. And more generally, I hope we can all continue to find modes of solidarity and alliance as friends for the end of this world and the building of a better new one before it's too late. So I don't want to hold everybody who needs to go, but thank you everyone so much. And this will be posted on our YouTube channel soon. I will let you all know, and I appreciate everyone sharing and taking your time and thinking. And I've also learned an enormous amount, so I'm so grateful. Everything. So thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Lots of love across species to all of you. May we do better as humans in the future.
Thank you, everybody.
With the guidance of these discussions.
So
Take care.
nice to meet you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All
Bye.
right. All right.
Bye.